Good morning, everybody. We're just going to make sure that everything's ready in terms of screens and sound, and you can hear us all okay and everything like that. And then we will get going with Officer Goodwin today, taking us through association.
Get on, get off.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Sorry, we're just having a little bit... Do you know what? We've had no technical issues this morning, he says, touching wood. Let me just fire back up a different camera. Let's have a quick look. There we are. Okay, you can see Officer Goodwin. He's just here over to my left. You can see Harriet. She's over here on my right. So Harriet is our sales and marketing director. She is here to make sure that everything is done properly, that there's no bad language.
As if I ever do.
And such like that. So, good morning, welcome. I'm just going to make sure the sound's all good and level. Yeah, we've had no technical problems this morning. It's been lovely.
You're learning.
Yeah, I am. We've also changed our cameras. So I think our cameras are actually a little bit clearer, a little bit crisper for you. So we are pretty much there and ready to go. I'm just going to read again some of the comments because I'd like to keep up with them. Harriet does shout them out as we go. Today we're going to do association. I was just having a conversation with Officer Goodwin. A really interesting one because normally everything we've done so far is part of the guided tour, isn't it? There's a separate specific section on visits, there's a separate specific section on a cell, a separate specific section on segregation, C-wing. But there isn't really, and healthcare, but there isn't really a separate section on association. It's kind of stuff that's talked about as part of a tour rather than its own dedicated piece. So it's going to be an interesting one today because he's going to have to think really very much about what he's going to say. So lots and lots of questions, please, today, and that will help us get through it. So we're going to do this for about 45 minutes as normal, and obviously we'll do Q&A throughout. We've got cameras that are basically covering all of the association area on the twos. We've also got cameras further down the landing, which we'll be able to get onto the showers and show you what the showers look like later on. And so I know there's been lots of questions about that, and we'll also be able to show you the length of the landing so you can see the distance that officers would have had to trek and stuff. And I've put in an extra long mic cable because I thought it might even be a little bit of fun to put a camera right at the far end of the landing, send Officer Goodwin to the opposite end of the landing, hit an alarm bell and see how quickly he can run down.
What?
So I think we're pretty much there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Officer G to go and get himself somewhere into, well, wherever you want to start, really. Also very exciting for us, we have got a open date. I know we spoke about opening on the 20th of June. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I'm not going to go into that, but that didn't happen. So we... I don't know if you noticed, but Harriet looking up at me there with a shh. But we are going to be opening on the 4th of July. We're definitely opening on the 4th of July. We've got some voucher codes coming out in the next 24 hours, which will give you discounts on any guided or guide-led tour, any activity or event. So basically discounts on everything apart from our self-guided, which already has a really fantastic discount if you book online. So we are open from the 4th and we're good to go. Guided tours will begin on the 18th of July, along with escape rooms, prison break events, sleepovers, and then from the beginning of August we open back up our activity area with kids archery, laser mazes, and angel and axe throwing. So loads and loads of really cool stuff happening over the coming weeks and certainly over the summer. Let's have a quick look. What else do I need to plug? Most Haunted have got some cameras. We set some Most Haunted cameras up on C Wing, so you can see the inside C Wing 24/7 for the next few weeks. If you jump onto ghostcams.co.uk, and you can see those. And I'm just being told this is a really quite a special one for me, in the sense that we've had some of our viewers, some of our followers have set up a Shrewsbury Prison fan club page, or a fan club group. It's called Shrewsbury Prison Cellmates, and I'm sure at some point somebody will tag it into the comments. I'm sure Kathy will probably put a link in there so you can see it, and you can obviously join that. And basically it's a fan page that those guys run. They talk about everything Shrewsbury Prison based. I think I've talked enough. Yeah, yeah, I'm getting a nod from Officer G. Okay, so let me get the cameras up. Okay, there we go. So you can see we've got a nice range of cameras this morning. Let's bring you up. Okay, Officer Goodwin, perfect. Oh, look at that. They can see all the cables and everything. Right, let's check your mic.
1, 2.
Oh, yeah.
Am I on?
Yeah, I can definitely hear you. Yeah.
You can usually hear me anyway without a microphone.
Oh, we can hear you without a microphone, but I'm guessing that's years of experience of shouting across landings.
Prisons are noisy places.
Yeah. Okay, right. I think we're pretty much good to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn my microphone down. Officer Goodwin, it is all yours.
Excellent. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to, I think, what are we on? Episode 6 now, Joel. We're going to talk about association today. Association is basically where prisoners are out of their cells. Any time that they spend out of their cell is based as what they call association time. Now, during the daytime, mostly prisoners are either going to work, education, possibly going to the gym, going out on exercise, and basically that's still counted as part of their time out of cell. So it's part of the association time. And then they can come out in the evenings as well. Now, bearing in mind Shrewsbury Prison, I'm going to talk a little bit mostly about Shrewsbury, but nearly all the Victorian prisons that I remember didn't really start association in evenings until probably the mid-90s. Before that time, prisoners were usually locked up at 5 o'clock at night, and there might be a small time of 10 minutes for prisoners to come out to do what they call the slop out, because up until the mid-90s we didn't have toilets in cells, so basically prisoners were having to come to slop out their bowls, get some clean water, and go back to their cells. At about 7:30 at night, we used to bring tea urns up onto the landings and go around door to door. And let prisoners have a hot drink of tea. Diesel, it was called, for good reason. It was made by the kitchen workers at about 6 o'clock, and then it was all left to brew away for a good hour and a half with a couple of pounds of sugar in it and leave the tea bags in till the last minute. So this stuff was pretty thick and strong. But it was one of those things, there were no choices. You either took the tea or you took nothing.
Sorry, I promise I won't do that too much today. Can I just jump in there? We do make diesel here. Officer Goodwin and Officer Wilcoxon, they showed us how to make diesel when we first opened. And we do make diesel in the restaurant. So if you are here and you'd like to try real prison diesel, we make it at 9 o'clock in the morning. So by the time you get here for 11, 12, it is pretty much perfect. It comes in one form: warm, wet, and sweet.
Yeah, if you like it sweet and thick, we've got what you need. So association basically, although before the 90s some prisons did have association out in the evening, because prisons operate on 4 different levels. You've got high security, you've got category B prisons, so you've got Cat A high securities, you've got Cat Bs, Cat Cs, less security, and open prisons. So they would have had a different regime. Even when I joined way back in 1977, they had then open and closed Borstals, and Borstals used to run association in the evenings. So it is different, but it was mostly the old Victorian jails that locked up at 5 o'clock at night. Once we put toilets in the cell and put power in the cells, this then allowed us then to put the old recesses where they slopped out, which I'm going to show you in a minute. They put shower units in there, which allowed then prisoners to come out in the evening to have showers, to go onto the telephones, which were then located on the landings, and also come and see the staff if they got any problems. They were allowed to associate with each other, and you'll see behind me, you'll see some snooker tables, little mini snooker tables, table tennis, and different things, and sit on tables and play games, the usual board games. So they were allowed to associate with each other. Now, on these landings, there are 4 landings at Shrewsbury, so it's a reasonably big wing, 1s, 2s, 3s and 4s. There'd be roughly about 330 to 340 prisoners in the evening, all out of their cells at the same time. And there would be 8 staff to supervise those 330 to 340 prisoners, 2 staff on each landing. In the more modern days, in the last 20 years, when we've had a lot more technology in our prisons, we've had offices with computers and telephones and radios and all those things. Basically, one staff member will be caught up in the office doing the paperwork, answering prisoners' queries through the computer system and such like. So there'd be one officer out on patrol at all times. So you have to appreciate that only 2 staff to supervise up to 90 prisoners. It's no easy task. You can't see everything all the time. You can walk around, keep an eye on what's going on. So it'll be fair to say that when landings run quietly and there's no particular problems going on, or none that we can see, there are always things going on in a prison that we don't get to see or know about. We know it happens, but it's one of those things about what you can see and what you can find. Prisons run, and they run basically with the cooperation of prisoners. I know that's a difficult thing for some people to listen to, and perhaps they think that can't be right. When you've got 8 staff supervising 330, you're not running a wing or doing association with the power of force. You do it by good management and dealing it with prisoners fairly, applying the rules equally and fairly to them all, and not this discrimination going on. And basically, 99% of prisoners see that happening. They go along with the system. They go along with it and all that thing. Yes, we'll have our ups and downs, you always do. There are always 1 or 2 prisoners that just can't help but kick against the system, or they've got a problem with another prisoner and they end up having a punch-up, or being assaulted, or assault somebody else, such like. You must remember too, with landings out these days, when all the prisoners are out, you've got a higher incidence possibly of violence going on in prisons, because now they've got more access to each other. They've got more access for drug distribution, and obviously the gang and the bullies that may be trying to intimidate and run the landings have got more access to prisoners. So basically, when you do let them out, there is an increase of those issues that are going to take place.
I'm just going to grab into that a second, because I remember when we first met and I first came on the tours with you guys, we first went round and hearing that prisons are run by the cooperation of prisoners, as you put it, rather than by force. And I just remember being absolutely, I think gobsmacked is probably the right word. I was really surprised that I didn't realise, and somebody that'd been married to somebody that worked in a prison, I didn't realise that prisons were run effectively by cooperation as opposed to force. It was always in my mind that you do as you're told, and if not, then you'll be in serious trouble, which is obviously what happens. But yeah. I always kind of thought it was run by force, and it's a common misconception, isn't it, from people that visit. I know that's a big kind of, I hear it when you deliver tours, you say that, and people go, oh, wow, like it's one of those.
Well, I'll give you sort of a classic example of that. When it comes to the evenings, if prisoners are out in the evenings and they're having to, and it's time for lockup in Shrewsbury after association, it was usually about 7:45, and we'd go around. The 2 staff of the landing would get up, and we could lock the whole landing up probably in about 6 to 7 minutes. And the vast majority of those prisoners, when we shouted, "Okay, lads, time to be back behind your doors," and have a laugh and a joke, bang up time. Happiness is door shaped. All the usual things. Hurry up, get behind my beer's getting warm, the usual crack that we'd have, and we get some obvious replies from prisoners as well. But 99% of them would just disappear behind their cell doors, and you could hear their doors banging. Bang, 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 and then you go around and check that the doors are locked, secured, count the prisoners. There's always the last 1 or 2, as there is anywhere. There's always the last one or two that are doing that last minute running around cells. When we were here, the smoking was still allowed, so looking to get some tobacco, a light, Risley papers, because they sort of didn't have civilian cigarettes as such. So there was all those little things, but basically one or two odd prisoners. And so, yeah, and that's a classic example, because if they all refused to go behind their cell doors, what would you do? With 2 staff on a landing, what would you do? And the reality is that's the way it works. So it must operate on some kind of cooperation. But there you go. You can probably see behind me now. I'm just going to move a little bit now.
Sorry, Officer Goodwin, before you move on, because someone's going to ask, so I'm going to just jump in there. Did that ever happen? Did it ever happen to a point where effectively prisoners had almost got together and decided they weren't going to go in that night and they were just going to stay out, and you said, get in, and they just go, no?
Not at Shrewsbury. I must be honest, in the 25 years I was here, I never remember an issue where prisoners in block, in other words, the whole wing, the whole landing, refused to go behind their cell doors. We've had 1 or 2 that have refused to go behind for different reasons. You must remember, in a prison like this, they nearly always put 2 prisoners in a cell. And although the prisoner may not tell you why they're refusing to go in that cell, you might make some assumptions. You might make an assumption that they don't want to go behind that cell door because there's a problem with the other prisoner that's in there. But they won't actually tell you that themselves. So they may find another reason why they're not going behind the door. Somewhere along the line, we will have to get staff and possibly be involved in physically removing that prisoner. Obviously, we're not going to force them into that cell just in case there's an issue going on, but they'll probably end up going down to the segregation unit. And we'll deal with that issue the next day, whatever that takes, stuff like that. Yeah. The landings, you said, mostly you can see behind me. I think you can still see up on the wall there. Can they see on the wall there, Joel? You'll see the telephone little kiosks there. When we brought phones out in the 90s, prisoners would go onto the phones there, and it would be supervised by staff. Prisoners were limited to the amount of time they could be on the phone. Staff used to have a big long list, so they'd come and put their names down for the phone that morning, and then at night time we'd pull them out, and we'd have little time slots, and we'd literally get them out and they'd come off the phone. Occasionally you'd get a prisoner that refused. Well, we'd say time up, time to get off the phone, 30 seconds, and they'd just keep talking and keep talking and keep talking, and that eats into another prisoner's time, and that causes all the issues you can imagine. So there was a lot of pressure on the prisoner, pressure on the staff, and if we were desperate, we would just phone up the control room and they would just switch the phone off. So they'd just press a button and the phone would go dead. Naturally, the prisoner then wasn't over impressed with being cut off from the middle of a conversation. They've got all kinds of their own issues going on, but that's the only way we had to manage it. And there were only 4 phones on this landing, 1 sort of each in corner, and that's for 80 or 90 prisoners. So there was a lot of pressure built behind it. These days, they're literally going to be putting telephones in every single cell in the country. New prisons, such as HMP up in Wrexham, Berwyn, as it's called, they've actually built the prison with telephones in the cells. Now, they don't have free access to these phones to call anybody they like and stay on the phones for as long as they want. You can control the phones. You can put the amount of time they're on, when the phones are switched on, when they're switched off, how many times a prisoner can access the phone, and they can only access telephone numbers that they've submitted, and we've checked to make sure that they're bona fide numbers.
Are calls listened to? Because you always see on TV, don't you, that calls are listened to?
All phone calls that prisoners make and staff are recorded. They go onto a recording system, and basically during the night there'll be staff on nights whose job will be to sort of randomly select phone calls to listen to make sure that there's nothing untoward going on. Obviously there's all kinds of issues that may be going on. They may be trying to sort of do a deal. They may be sometimes still carrying on with their criminal enterprise. They've got their code words, they've got their slang words to use, but basically staff are just, and there are prisoners that are vulnerable, that may be talking about things like taking their own lives or harming themselves. So staff can listen on that, and we can do those interventions. The reality of the world is there are many illegal mobile phones smuggled into prison. And the reality with that is that prisoners now have got access to these mobile phones. So if they want to do their nefarious things, and they want to do those things that are illegal that we wouldn't allow, they're going to be doing it on their mobile phones. As such like. So you can see there is the difficulty with mobile phones, because they may be when you think about it, possibly witness intimidation, bullying. Some are still using these phones to run their drug businesses outside or whatever stuff they're getting up to. So you can see the problem with mobile phones.
And somebody's just asked about letters, because obviously it's about communication,
yes.
So to the outside world. Were letters read and checked by staff before they got to prisoners?
Interestingly...
in and out.
Sorry?
Both letters coming into the jail and letters going out.
Interestingly, before phones came into the prison, obviously there was a great deal more of what they call written correspondence. So prisoners would write letters and send them out and they'd get reply. There is no limit on the amount of letters that a prisoner could receive, but there's a limit on the amount of prison letters that we give to a prisoner that's paid for at public cost. I'm not sure if the rules changed. Probably hasn't, but they don't use letter writing a great deal. If you're a convicted prisoner, you're entitled to get 1 letter sent out at public expense per week. If you're a remand prisoner, that's a prisoner that's sort of innocent or not proved guilty, still waiting to do the court process, they were entitled to 2 letters per week at public expense. They could have more letters, but they had to pay for them extra letters. So they would buy a stamp and we would supply them with the paper to go with that paper and envelope to go with that letter. So there is a limit. All letters that go out and come in are liable to be censored. We do not do 100% censorship of all mail. So they are randomly selected, but all letters will be opened. There are staff employed that come in and open every single letter that comes into a prison, because sometimes families are sending money into prisoners, postal orders, sometimes cash, and just to check that there's nothing in those letters that shouldn't be there. Because sometimes some prisoners are quite enterprising if they're trying to smuggle drugs into prison. Years ago they used to try putting things like, it might be heroin or something, whatever, underneath the stamp itself, or using the sticky part of the envelope to liquidize it and it could be steamed off. It has been known perhaps these days that they've actually impregnated a whole letter with some kind of liquid drug, and when it comes into the prison, if it's not checked and it gets through the system, you can tear it off and trip strips and smoke it, and or re-steam it and re-liquidize it. So there are many enterprising ways that they will try to get stuff in. So that all letters will be checked, but not all letters will be read. There is a difference in there. And mails going out again will be censored on a random basis. If there's anyone that comes in that's relatively high security, if you're talking about high security prisoners, prisoners need to have their mail read on a continual basis, they will be told. They will be told by a governor that their mail will be 100% censored. So everything that comes in, everything that goes out will be censored. However, except for legal papers.
Someone's just flagged that. They've asked about Rule 39, which I think that's the solicitor's rule.
Rule 39 is a legal letter. So if it's been stamped with Rule 39, it basically means while we're still entitled to open that letter, but not read it. But very often you'll find that most prisons leave the letter closed, and if it comes up onto the landing when I'm working on the landing, what I would do is I would call the prisoner up, or if I'm taking it around the cells, I'd say, you've got a legal letter there, can you do me a favour, can you just open it up please and shake the letter? And that's basically just open the letter, shake it to make sure there's nothing in there. So for security reasons we have to make an assumption there may be the possibility that someone of the legal profession may be bending the rules. It's extremely rare, but it's still a security measure that we put in place. So Rule 39 is, we don't have any access to reading their personal information on who wants to. But no.
This morning is really interesting. There's a lot of people watching, lots of people commenting, a lot of ex-prisoners, I'm guessing, on today, which is great to see. And they're leaving some brilliant comments, and they're talking about things that happened to them inside, and their input's brilliant. And you said a minute ago about there's ingenious ways that prisoners come up with doing things, and somebody's just said that they used to get 10 minutes on the phone.
Yes.
And if they went over 10 minutes, however, if they hung up before, they would beep to give them a warning. If they hung up at that point and then redialed, as long as they had the phone credit, it would let them do it. They could get an extra 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's right. The computerized system was relatively basic in those days, as you can well imagine. However, if there wasn't a huge demand for the phones on the landings, I think most staff didn't have a big issue if a prisoner says, can I go back on, boss? Yeah. If the phone was disengaged when they made a phone call and they couldn't get through to start with, we'd say, try again. If it didn't work, we then would say, I'll see if I can get you back on later on. At this moment in time, I've got to keep with the list that I'm running because other prisoners have booked their times, of course. And if we can, normally, if we find a slot or we get to the end of the night, we go, listen, I can get you a quick 5 minutes on the phone. And generally, it worked pretty well that way, to be honest with you. But putting phones in cells will do away with all that issue. So yeah, they used to have phone cards. Phone cards were just like a credit card, looked exactly the same as a credit card, and there were all kinds of ways that they could deviate that card to make it as if it never ran out, because it had a limit of how much money was on the card, and basically they found out their different ways to be able to make that card operate literally free. That's done away with these days. Prisoners operate on what they call the PIN system. They get a PIN number when they come in, and they have to put the PIN number into the phone for the phone to become live for their limited amount of numbers that they can call. If they try to call a number that isn't on the list, then the phone won't connect. So that's the way they worked it then. But as I said, they're in the process, I believe, of putting phones in all of the cells. So basically, it'll do away with the pressure on the landings of getting onto a very few phones. And they'll be in cells. Now, a lot of people have different feelings about whether they should have phones in cells, and whether it's right, or whether they should be made not to have phones. That's the way it is. The government have made decisions that they consider that to be a reasonable thing to do to allow prisoners to have as much access as it's possible within their families. And that's where we stand today.
And I
different staff have different views about that too.
Yeah, and I think, and again, the same with the viewers here. There's a few different people that have said a few different things as we go through. Some that we see quite regularly about how prison's more like a hotel these days, how it's too easy, so on and so, and those types of comments. But I think, again, I know we've covered it, and I know we'll cover bits of it later. The reality is, before 1995, there was no sanitation in the cells, there was no electric in the cells, and there was 3 men in there, each with a bucket. Now that's an horrendous way to live. And when you think about what it's like now, and it's that modernisation, isn't it? Because as we spoke about before, going to prison, going to prison is the punishment. Being removed from society is the punishment, not being mistreated when you're in prison. And then again, there's the idea of having TVs and games consoles and such like that. Actually, does give prisoners some form of entertainment, and therefore they're not out causing trouble. And then there's the
it's one of those balances. I suppose at a material level, prisoners get huge amounts more than they've ever had before. Like you said, TVs in their cells, they've got phones in their cells. Many brand new prisons will have showers in the cells, so there isn't this sort of chokehold place with we have 6 showers on each landing for 80 odd prisoners, so you can imagine they don't just get to access it all day. They'll have to wait until the association time, so there's a bit of a squeeze on that. So all those things are material things, and from that point of view, you might say, yes, they get all these things. But bearing in mind, it may not be so much what you give prisoners, it's about their experience while they're in jail. The reality is, over the years, there's a lot more violence in prisons. There's a lot more violence prisoner on prisoner. There's a lot more prisoners that harm themselves. There's a lot more mental health issues in prisons. There's a lot more violence on staff in prisons. There's a lot more drug addiction going on in prisons. So all those things will have their own issues and problems. I'll be honest with you, I think staff today do an absolutely wonderful job because they work in much more complicated times than I did when I joined in the 70s. It was quite simple in the 70s. You were taught you don't really speak to prisoners unless you have to tell them to do something, or you might have a little bit of a basic conversation, and they did what they were told, and the answers were yes or no. And it was quite rigid. The rules were enforced really quite rigid on staff as well as on prisoners, of course. That world's moved on. Just like society moves on, prisons tend to move on with it. So we're only a reflection of sort of the society's attitudes outside, to be honest with you.
And I think that's a good point to pick up when you're saying prisons move on, because you were just talking about the modernisation of cells in terms of putting phones into cells and computer systems, which we know and we discussed previously with visits and visitation orders. It reduces the amount of paperwork officers have to do, which allows them to spend more time on the landing doing the job that they should be doing. But it's also a big reason for why so many prisons closed in 2013, or certainly one of the reasons the government put forward, is because you take a Victorian jail like this, to modernise it, to put phones into cells, to put tablets into cells, to basically put in the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure and the comms infrastructure to allow prisoners to do those types of things, it is deemed that it is cheaper to build a completely new prison than it is to try and remodernise or modernise an existing one.
You know, it's an odd one, that, and this is from a personal perspective. They closed that prison. There was some of the reasons. They cost too much to run, and they also said that these old Victorian prisons really aren't fit for the purpose that we live in, the society we live in today. However, I'm going to say, and perhaps there may be other ex-staff watching this, there may be current staff watching this who work in old prisons and will actually go, and that's not true at all. New prisons have as many problems as the old ones do. This old prison, I've got to be honest, 25 years I worked here, was a good prison, if you can say it in those terms. If you had to be in a jail, Shrewsbury was a place to be. There was very relatively little violence going on. We had no major incidents in this prison. We had relatively little violence in this prison, prisoner on prisoner or prisoners on staff, and everything ran pretty well, even though they didn't have all those modern facilities that you'd get in a modern jail. I did a visit once of a brand new prison, just been opened. About 500 prisoners were in there. And some of them, me and another staff member, recognised us from the time in Shrewsbury. "Hey, boss, what you doing here?" I said, "We're just taking a look round." And one of them actually said, "Can you get me a transfer back to Shrewsbury?" And he was in a prison that wasn't even 6 months old. "Can you get me a transfer back to Shrewsbury? Do my time in Shrewsbury any day of the week." And that sort of says everything you need to say. And that's coming from the horse's mouth. That's coming from prisoners. I've had many ex-prisoners come here on visits with their families on their own, and they've said the same thing. As prisons go, Shrewsbury. I remember distinctly, some years ago now, obviously, we had some prisoners come down from Manchester. When you think of Strangeways, a big jail, big city jails, and coming down from Liverpool on what we used to call overcrowding drafts. And that's basically, there's no space up there for them, so we find some space here. And they didn't want to be here. I've had one or two prisoners as they come through reception on the landing, "I want to be in this place, little Mickey Mouse jail, little country jail full of bumpkins and all that." And then in about 4 or 5 weeks, we got the space, time and the necessity to send them back to Strangeways, send them back to Liverpool or one of those bigger city jails, and all of a sudden they didn't want to go. All of a sudden, I can't go back there, boss. I've got problems there. I've got issues. I've got things. I can't go back onto those prisons. And that's because when they realised that if you were going to be in a prison, this was probably less pressure to be in this jail than perhaps some of the bigger ones, they really didn't want to leave it at the end. Sounds, that's the way it was.
Those sentiments are being absolutely replicated and agreed with by some of the ex-prisoners that are on today. And somebody's just said that when they were here, if prisoners were violent and were constantly fighting and being difficult, then they would get shipped out to HMP Bristol, or they would go to one of the higher class prisons, one of the higher categories.
Being a small jail and not a big, large segregation unit, only sort of little 4 cells. Yeah, we'd try the normal things. If we got prisoners that give us problems, and it's like all things there, we get them down, put them in the block. Hopefully we'll get them to readjust their thinking and their behaviour, but sometimes they choose not to. Sometimes they're struggling. Sometimes there's issue in the prison, and if necessary, when we've tried, we go, okay, it's time to move on, and that prisoner will be transferred out to another prison. But it doesn't always come at nil cost. We don't just get rid of one prisoner and have an empty space. What you'll find is we make deals with other prisons very often. I don't know if it happens today, and we'll say, listen, we got somebody that needs to come out of our jail, and they'll be going, oh, can we do a swap? And the other prisoner will send us somebody that's struggling or having problems in that prison, and they will come to us. And it's basically, I suppose you could call it fresh start. They come down here and they'll have a chance to get down a new routine, get away from whatever's going on there, and hopefully readjust. Some do, and most of them did settle, but many don't. And they just keep bouncing around the system on a permanent basis because they're just so difficult to manage and control. And it's not good for the rest of the prison. Yeah.
So I've got loads of questions that are coming in, and we will get through them. But I'm curious. I want to pick it up. I obviously know the answers because I've been through the tours with you previously. But just looking behind you at the association area, so it's not exactly as it was, but it's not dissimilar. There were pool tables, there were ping pong tables. I will change the cameras yet. There was books and stuff like that. Let me just see where he's going. Who knows where he's going? Officer, that's it. He's off for tea.
Where do you want me? Can you get me on?
If you turn around and face that camera, you'll be okay.
Face the camera.
Let me. Okay. Hold on. Hold on, it's not the BBC, remember, it's more like Channel 5 Productions. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Can I just ask very quickly, because you just walked past it. So prisoners obviously out in association, you've got potentially up to 80, 85 prisoners on a landing, 2 officers. So you could have 50, 60 prisoners obviously out at any one time. I can see from here the pool table in the middle of the landing. Pool balls, pool cues, surely the idea that you can just put some pool balls into a sock or use a pool cue and ready-made weapons.
Yes.
I mean, talk us through that.
There are always elements of risk. I remember snooker tables being in prisons even when I was in the 70s. There were snooker tables around the place as well. Yes, there's always a risk. In actual fact, there was a larger, the pool table you can see there was a much larger one. It was a 3/4 snooker table that was there, and we did keep our table tennis tables down on the ones, one floor below us, to create a bit more space. However, sometimes the pool cues, if prisoners are having a bit of an argy-bargy, it might be over the game, there might be something going on around the landings, and before you know it, the pool cues are up and being used. And remember, snooker balls, put them in the old sock, give them a swing round. You're talking about a relatively deadly implement. Before they had electricity in their cells, prisoners were allowed to buy PP9 batteries. They're quite a big square battery, and they carry more power to keep their radios, as they used to have, running for much longer. They used to find those put into socks and being used as a weapon, of course. Some prisoners allowed prisoners to have their own snooker cues in prison, so they basically can have them bought in, or they buy them to something like the Argos online shop, something like that, and they can have their own snooker. It depends on the prison, it depends on the security, it depends on the prisoner, depending on the level, because you've got basic, standard and enhanced prisoners, and enhanced prisoners usually are entitled to more of those facilities. They can lose them, but they do get used. One of the things at night time, when it was time to finish off at night and go behind the cell doors, we'd always say to the last people on, okay lads, finish up, bring the snooker balls. Their job was to bring those snooker balls and the pool cues back to the office. We would count them. Well, they went into a special box where everything fitted properly. If there was a snooker ball missing, we want to know where it is. And the reality is the prisoners used to find it. We'd say, listen, this snooker balls aren't coming out again until we get the snooker ball back. There is a risk that we're going to be banging up tomorrow searching for it. And they'd get round the landing and find it, because sometimes somebody would steal a snooker ball because they thought it was a clever thing to do, because they're having a bit of fun, more than anything else, because a snooker ball technically isn't going to be a particularly big weapon in its own right. But we always made sure that we got them back. And once again, sometimes it worked. Sometimes we'd hang on to the snooker balls for a couple of days and say, we need the snooker balls back. Somebody's got them. Well, let's find out. And we'd leave the prisoners to their own devices. Well, we used to send the word out, and they'd find the snooker ball somewhere. Somebody had got it. I won't say much more about that.
Well, you have said previously, and again, I know why you don't, because obviously you're careful about your audience, and obviously when people are here on tours, you can gauge your audience and see how far you can talk and certain things you can say. But it does come down to the fact that ultimately prisoners do kind of manage themselves to a degree, don't they? You will have prisoners that might take a snooker ball joking around, and other prisoners know that they're going to get locked down if that happens. They don't want to be locked down, so they will politely say, let's say, to another prisoner, put that back.
Yeah, you must remember when staff are supervising, 2 staff are supervising 90, there's very much a situation where they've, like I said, they've got access to each other. And there are, first of all, let's dispel this myth that all prisoners are anti the system. They've come in to give everybody a hard time and all that. It just ain't true. The bulk of prisoners come in, they just want to do their time and go home. They'll kick along with the system and all that. And they want to make life as easy as possible, and they want to gain as much as they can out of it, certainly in the sense of coming out of their cells, getting association, going to the gym, going on exercise, and all the other things that they can get. They don't want to lose those. Once they've been behind that cell door, sometimes from 7 o'clock at night, 8 o'clock at night until 8 o'clock the next morning, they want to come out and they want to be able to enjoy those facilities. So yeah, it can be partly self-regulating. Not always, of course. It depends on the prisoner and stuff like that. But yeah, it's the way it is. I want to take a walk down the landing, unless there's anything else you want me to point out while I'm up here, Joel. I'm just going to take a big, long walk down there, if you can get the cameras.
I will.
I'm going to stop at the recesses.
Well, what I'll do then is, before you move, let me just spin the recess camera so it can see you coming down, so you can see the angle. I'm just going to have a quick look and ask you one of the questions you can answer whilst I do that. people are obviously talking about sugar in water. I know we've had that conversation in the past in the cells.
Yeah, probably the most deadliest thing you can do, boiling water and sugar mixed up together.
Okay,
Napalm, it's called in prison.
Here's one. I'll let you answer this whilst I just change the camera quickly. Somebody has said they don't understand how prisoners get mobile phones into prison. So I'll leave you to answer that one very quickly whilst I change the camera.
Well, how do they get mobile phones? I probably could say
remember there's kids watching.
Whatever you can imagine, they've thought of. Drones can be a big issue in prisons these days, certainly in some prisons that are spread over 15, 20 acres or more, and there's lots of open land around where prisoners have access to. But remember, drones coming in, they can carry 3, 4, or 5 mobile phones. You must remember also there are some prisoners, and they will smuggle them hidden inside their bodies, and I'll let you imagine quite well how that happens. We do have procedures in reception to look for these things, but that's one of the ways they may attempt. It may even be a visitor that's coming in and doing it that way. They can go to the toilet, retrieve it, and try to find some way to hand it over to the prisoner while they're on the visits. There is a small element of staff, and I mean a very, very small, fortunately. Sometimes the odd one or two get corrupted, and they may be used to bring stuff into prisons. Trust me, I always think they're the most dangerous and the most difficult of all because we trust them. We give them a set of keys, they ask to do the job, and they're more difficult for us to find out because we give them free access to a prison with a set of keys. But you can ask 99.9% of staff what they think of staff that are corrupt. They won't really speak, they'll just basically go, because that's what we think of them. You sort of expect some prisoners to try to smuggle stuff into prisons, and you expect some of their friends, families and associates to smuggle things into prisons, but not staff. That's just not acceptable at any level whatsoever. So the sooner they get caught out, and given, personally I give them plenty of jail time. Plenty of jail time.
They do get quite a big sentence, can't they? If you're in a trusted position, a prison officer, for example, you get caught smuggling something into jail, go to court, you can get quite a few years for.
It depends, really. I know that it's nearly always, in my experience of when I read the stuff on newspapers, and it usually hits the major tabloids, I think on average they can get between 3 and 5 years. I suppose it depends on the offence. But nearly always it will be involved in either bringing in mobile phones and or drugs. So by their very nature of those offences, they should be expecting 3 to 5. I'd like to see it go between 5 and 10 personally, and pay. And I know I'm not one for saying everybody should come to jail for long times, but prison officers and other prison staff member that are nurses, teachers, civilian workers, other people that have access to prisoners, there are no excuses whatsoever. So yes, I would make those. They are expected to be a much higher standard of behaviour.
Yeah, and somebody's just said, and I'm not making excuses or reasoning or anything along those lines, but I do think this is probably a very relevant point. Somebody said people will do amazing things if the money's right, and obviously pay for prison officers is not that great anymore. The conditions are not fantastic.
No, I mean, sadly, in my experience, I've seen and it's a personal thing again, you might find the prison department would argue the toss on that one, but I think that the actual conditions of service for prison officers has deteriorated quite a lot, drastically in my thing. When I joined the service, my retirement age was 60 years old, and they consider that to be old enough to be running around landings and having to deal with people that are on an average age of about 28 to 30 in prisons. And then they decided to increase it to 68. So if you're in the job today, before you can pick up any pension that you might have earned, you're going to be having to wait till you're 68. I've never seen a 68-year-old police officer jumping over people's back gardens. And the other thing I've never seen anybody jumped out of an armoured car, young soldiers with their rifles all there ready to go, and Corporal Jones hops out of the back. Hey, whoa, where are they, Mr. Mannering? They don't like it up 'em. It just doesn't happen. And in this job where you've got a younger generation on average in prison populations and a lot more violence, I think. As far as pay and conditions go, I'm going to mention it because I think it's important.
Do we want to do that now, or do we want to do that next week when we're in the Governor's office? Because next week we're in the Governor's office.
I'll do it when I get to the Governor's office.
That probably really fits quite nicely.
Take a note so I don't forget.
I will do. I've got my PA over here on the right. Somebody just asked who's that on my right. It's my personal assistant, Harriet. No, Harriet is our sales and marketing director. She's here to make sure we behave and stay on point and don't say anything we shouldn't say. Harriet, can you make a note of that one for next week when we're in the Governor's office? Because next week we are in the Governor's office. Yes, we are ready. Officer Freeman has just asked if Graham could explain about extra exercise in the evenings during the summer. I'm assuming it's because he's forgotten.
Yeah, that's a good point, Mike. Thanks very much for that. Normally in the evenings, if we've got a hot weather like we have today, if we have the staffing levels available, we will, perhaps not the whole prison will come out and exercise, but we might say, well, tonight, between the hours of perhaps 6 and 7 or 6 and quarter past 7, we will get the prisoners out onto the yards during the night, just to get them out to the fresh air. These cells can generate a huge amount of heat in them over these hot weather. Although I do remember there are some prisons where they have evening association. When I was at Featherstone Prison, Category C prison, one below this one, it was quite automatic to unlock the gates, and they all had their own individual grassed area fenced in outside their house blocks. And it's perfectly normal for them to step out in the evening. And they did. So they would go out and they could wander around, and that might be on top of any other possible exercise that they may have. At the weekends, those gates would be open to let them out off the house block in the morning and in the afternoon. On the weekends, not so much on the evenings on Saturday and Sunday. So it depends on the prison. When I was at Gartree Prison, that was a high security prison, they would have their day exercise, and sometimes they would come out in the evening as well, depending on staffing levels and security and all those kind of issues. Yeah. So it's a good point, Mick. Yeah, we do. If we can, we will, possibly.
Okay, I imagine he's going to start adding that into his tour now.
Sorry?
He'll start adding that into his tour now.
Stick that on your tour.
I think let's get on and do the showers and association and stuff like that. There are a few comments asking about things like pay and conditions. We will cover that next week when we're in the Governor's office. There's questions about the library. We are going to continue doing these every single week, still at 11 o'clock at the moment, and we're going to do different areas each week. So next week is the Governor's. Hold on. The week after is servery and food and stuff like that. So we'll do each, like I say, we will pick these questions up. We'll make notes of them if we don't answer them today. Right, let's have a look at the landing. So I've got a nice long shot of you from halfway down the landing. So what you can see now before you move, Officer Goodwin, is that is placed right outside the showers. It is slap bang halfway in the middle of the landing. So you're going to see now Officer Goodwin make his way down there.
Yeah, by standards, these are pretty long landings. It's a reasonably big wing, 4 floors, and a reasonable length. Some prisons are just smaller, and there are prisons that have got bigger landings that go up to what they call the 5s, so they're actually on 5 stories. So there's a lot of people in one relatively small place. Remember, when they were Victorian prisons, it wasn't an issue of prisoners moving around because they mostly spent all their time in a cell unless they were coming out to have disciplined exercise or coming out to work, sewing mailbags, which they did at Shrewsbury Prison right up into the 60s, sitting outside their cell doors before we built the workshops. And just moving down, be careful of the cables. I'm assuming you got me on the camera there. I'm just going to put the light on and switch on and show you our old recesses. You got it?
I have got. Oh, just keep turning. Yeah, just take the camera back for me ever so slightly. Just take
can
it
you see
back.
In there?
I can. Yeah, that's look fine. You can take the camera back a little bit if you like.
Can't hear you.
Do you want to take the camera back a little bit? Sorry, guys. As you know, this is not a BBC production. This is a more Channel 5 production. Am I allowed to say that, Harriet? I've just said it. So yeah. No, you're all good, Mr. G. We've got you loud and clear, and the fan's not too loud, so it's absolutely fine.
Can you hear me? Because I've got a lot of noise from the fans. You might be picking this noise up from the automatic fans that go in. This area you're seeing here, they're now little shower cubicles. So what you've got is, remember, they're not private in here. They're relatively public. Although in modern prisons that are built today and some that have been converted, there will be showers in the cells themselves. We had 6 showers in there. That was all, and a little area where they could get changed. There used to be the old recesses when prisoners didn't have toilets in their cells. So we had a couple of toilets at the back. So during the daytime, when we would allow prisoners to use a proper toilet rather than sitting on a little plastic potty. And there was a great big sluice down one side. And in the morning, what they call slop out, we'd unlock the prisoners and they'd come out to swill out, get rid of their toilet wastage, swill out their pots, get a jug of water. Sometimes they could get hot water in a bowl to have a strip wash in their cells.
So can I just...
They only got one shower a week.
Can I just check, because this I think leads in very nicely. Sorry guys, there's a fan in the shower, an automatic fan, so Officer Goodwin can't hear me with the fan, so he has to turn the lights off. Can I just check, because this is where people are saying that prisons are too easy now. So those shower cubicles never used to be there. It was a sluice with a small hose, similar to you might get on a campsite, for example, and you basically rinsed out your pots. Yeah. So you'd have 83 prisoners, sometimes more when you had 3 to a cell.
We had 3 in a cell here at one stage, yeah.
So you could have nearly 110 prisoners going in there, basically, lining up with their pots, washing them out, coming back out, putting the pots in the cells before going to work, effectively.
Yeah, and every morning that would happen, bearing in mind as well in those days, they used to have a system of, they weren't given razors to keep in their cells. So they had to get a razor, have a shave, and hand the razor back to staff. It was all controlled, so there was no blades around.
So you could argue that actually prison was harder back then. Well, it was almost the conditions back then were more inhumane in the sense of having to, have to use a bucket and then go wash out in the morning in a long line with everybody else.
Yeah, I suppose you've had to put some balance on it. We didn't put toilets in these cells to the mid-90s, and yet I suppose you have to ask yourself, is that something that you would consider to be over the top, and giving them a toilet in their cell and giving them water, fresh water in their cells? The reality is, that's a Victorian thing. This slopping out was something that hadn't changed for probably 100 years, where they were coming with a little plastic potty and you must remember the smell in these prisons wouldn't have been the most enjoyable. In the morning when they've been locked in their cells, and when I first came here, prisoners were locked up at 5 o'clock at night. There was no such thing as association in night time. So they're basically in the morning, these pots with a good chance of being full, and they'd be slopping them all out, and you've got stale urine and poo. That's going to have its own effect and smells as they're throwing it all into the recesses. Occasionally, it might get a bit dribbly down the landing as they walk into the recess, but that's the way it was. So it's probably not an overly pleasant experience for them, and not a pleasant experience for staff. But it's about a hygiene thing as well, of course. When you think of things like hepatitis and all that, which is common, can be much, there is quite a lot of hepatitis issues in prisons. Prisoners that are using dirty needles and stuff like that. There's a bigger risk that this stuff can contaminate. So it's basic hygiene.
Yeah, and this is what some people are saying behind me. I can see on the comments they're saying this is why parcels used to go out of the window.
Yes,
which is one of the reasons why there's a second.
I can't swear, but I'll let you imagine. They weren't called poo parcels. They were called something that begins with S.
Yeah. Don't Harry, I can see is cringy over here. But also, I know there used to be issues. There would be fights sometimes in the morning, and buckets would get thrown over one another, and all sorts of stuff.
It was always a risk. It was always a risk, because you're asking a lot of men to squeeze into a small space to do that, and if they've had a bad night for whatever reason, tempers can get a bit frayed and thing. Bearing in mind that there's a term called potting. Potting, and it's usually reserved for officers. I know very, very few prisoners that have been potted by another prisoner. That's basically throwing their toilet wastage over you. And potting of a staff member. Obviously, since we did away with the pots, and prisoners now have toilets in their cells, it didn't stop them potting staff. What they would do now is they would either take this stuff out of the toilet. There was a known trick, and it was raised quite recently on a female officer in another prison, where they literally put it into a squeezy bottle, shake it up until it breaks down like thick chocolatey stuff, and they walked out of the cell and squeezed it straight into the female officer's face.
Harriet is over here. She is... Her face is... I don't think she's ever heard that story before.
You can imagine the disgust in that.
Has, yeah.
However, the prisoner was charged with basically... I can't remember what it was now, but technically it's a bit like... I imagine it could be something like ABH, actual body...
As I say, it's like an assault, isn't it? Look, let's. I'm conscious I'm interrupting you too much. Questions are coming in. People want to know, when prisoners were having showers, things like how many showers they could have a day, how you process 83 prisoners through 6 showers. Were officers in there to watch them?
No.
You can see obviously the yellow side there for the razor blades. Talk us through how that whole thing happens for the next couple of minutes.
I'll put that back on. I'll just stand out the way because I won't need to be on camera for this. 6 showers, not a lot. And we give prisoners showers as often as we could. And that when you've got 6 showers to 80 odd prisoners, that isn't an easy thing to do. You can't just let them, remember they've gone to work during the daytime, they go to work or education in the afternoon, so evenings was a time. Now they only come out of their cells at 6 o'clock until 8 o'clock, so there are only 2 hours in the evening for them to have showers. But where we could, we would try to have, if we could in the daytime. We got some prisoners that don't go to work for whatever reason. There isn't a job for them. They can't work. They're usually locked up. We might get them out and shower them earlier, so it saves having to do that at night time. We managed. I imagine there's some prisoners never bothered having a shower for perhaps 2 or 3 days because they couldn't get into the showers. And if you could go to the gym and get yourself on the gym list, depending on your status in the prison, basic, standard and enhanced, depending on how many times you could use the gymnasium. Obviously there's a big block of showers in the gym, so they could also have the addition of having showers within the gym. But as far as an improvement goes, when I first come to this prison, right the way up until we put these showers in the middle 90s, prisoners got 1 shower per week. Baths are not allowed. There are no baths in the prison. Well, we did have 1 bath in the prison, which was located in the hospital. And only prisoners that have what they call a medical need for a bath can have a bath. So they report to the healthcare centre to have a bath, where they might need to soak in whatever substances they need to soak in. Other than that, it was a shower. As I said, most prisons that are built today, and some are being converted to have their own showers in cells, so it does away. And as far as thinking about, well, they can stand in a shower all day and waste water, most of them are on what they call a computer-controlled system. And I think in some prisons it's twice a day. So you can operate the shower for X amount of time on 2 occasions. And that would be a lot. So the system would shut the showers down, so there wasn't prisoners pressing buttons and just doing it, letting the water run out for the sake of it, as some might do, of course.
Because surely now thinking forwards, maybe, I don't know, 5 years, maybe even longer, but surely at some point prisons are going to get to the stage where every prisoner has obviously their ID or their card, and it's going to become more like how we would have it in some American theme parks. You almost have a wristband and you use that to swipe everything. Surely at some point prisons are going to get to that point where you effectively have a band or a card, and you will use that to activate the showers, you will use that to be able to get back into your cell. I know some prisons are called rooms, but I think that's kind of more of a Norwegian system.
Yeah, I don't know whether it's happening now in new prisons, but I can see in not the too far future we'll operate on biometrics. With that wristband, if you go into a workshop, it will clock you into the workshop and it will clock you out, and you'll get paid according to the amount of time that you were in there. If you go into the gymnasium or if you go somewhere, you'll literally biometric, and that will allow not only to time that people are doing the things, it will also be a security system as well, because the biometrics will be able to tell you how many people are in one place at any one time. Bearing in mind at the moment you have staff in workshops, they have to count the prisoners in, and they have to count them out. And every time a prisoner leaves or enters, you have to adjust your roll, because you have to have what they call a rolling count of prisoners, a rolling roll. So you always need to know where prisoners are at any particular time in the prison for emergencies and such like. I'm going to take a walk down the far end and walk straight back without talking, because I can't. Shall I come there? I was going to go all the way down the long landing. Too late now.
If you okay, well, look, why don't you go all the way to the far end of the landing?
Yeah.
Go all the way to the far end. I'll move the camera back over here, and then people can see the length of the entire landing. So if you go to the far end...
Well, I can turn this one down here as well.
Well, I'll come and grab it and I'll move it. Like I say, ladies and gents, this is a... Yeah, so if you wander all the way down to the far end...
Make sure I'm not tied up.
Yeah, you got it.
There's the fire. That would be locked normally. Fire hoses. Obviously you get a cell fire, particularly during the night when there's, you can't get the fire brigade very quickly, although ours is only 200 metres away from us. You've got the fire hoses to manage a fire. Bearing in mind, you've got to be careful about the kind of fires that you're tackling, because you can't have electrical fires and start spraying water over everything. The landing rails that you see, they've been replaced, because the old Victorian ones, they'd served their purpose over 100 years. Obviously the weld joint's getting a bit loose. But yeah, it's a fair old walk. Remember, you'd all have probably one staff member out at a time, walking up and down these landings. Because the other officer would be tied up in the office. That's not a term to use in prisons, is it? And you're coming all the way down here. Come back to me. So, and you usually take a walk right round the landing, and basically you're walking around. Some prisoners would still be in their cells. They might be playing cards or playing games or sitting chatting with their mates. They might be watching the TV together, stuff like that, while they're on association. And we'll just keep an eye on what's going on, bearing in mind you can't see everything all the time. But it's that you can only do the best you can. More modern prisons, believe it or not, and many prisons have cameras up on landings. Believe it or not, we never had cameras on these landings at any time, which is unusual because most prisons will have cameras watching down on the landing. And perhaps that's an indication, perhaps that Shrewsbury got to a point where perhaps we thought we didn't need to have cameras and we managed well or as good as we could without them, stuff like that. I don't know whether you can see the netting that's sitting on the landing. It's actually steel. It's not rope netting.
We'll do that when you come back up, sir.
Okay, sir.
Sorry.
I'm aware of time. On my way back up.
So that little dot you can see down there, that is Officer Goodwin. He is making his way back up to us now. Here he comes. It is a long landing. We just wanted to give you a feel for the length, basically, of the landings that we have. And those footsteps that you can hear, those are the noises we hear at night time. Stop, come back.
That's my daily count of 10,000 steps.
So those are the noises that we hear at night time, sometimes in the paranormal world when people talk about footsteps. Those exact noises is what we hear on landings above us.
When I first joined, very quickly, you used to be issued with leather-soled shoes. They didn't have these rubberized shoes that we get today. So when you're issued with you can imagine that clunk, 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 clunk down these landings, and nights and daytimes as well. So these are a little bit quieter.
Right, netting. We were talking about netting. Someone's just said that you take your job very seriously. They can see that the way you wandered down the landing there, you obviously took your job as an officer very seriously. And
I think it's important if you're going to do the job. Then any job that you do in life, you should either, first of all, be serious about the work that you want to do, and hopefully you get to enjoy it. You get to enjoy the job, even though there have been very dark moments in this job that I've done. There's been some hugely sad moments that I've experienced. There's been some extremely dangerous situations that I've been in this prison, and there's been some very funny times that I've been in this prison. And that's not just among staff, that's with prisoners as well. It's just one of those things. Remember, this is a whole community that's pretty much exclusive from the rest of society. And we have to manage this community, and you can't do that just by barking at people and shouting and bawling. So there is humour, a lot of humour in prisons. That helps lighten the load for many. So there's all those different issues that go on in a job, of course. But
so you can see, Officer Goodwin, that I've changed the camera so you can see the netting. If you're happy there, you can stay there. If you want to move forwards, obviously you can do. We're pretty much on the hour. So what we're going to do is we'll finish off with the netting. There has been it's a comment rather than a question. So I'll say it now, and then you can obviously pick up the netting. But it is from an ex-prisoner who said that they saw an officer get thrown over the banisters once by a lifer, and that officer broke his ankle.
Oh, right. I think you landed on the netting.
I think so, but I know this prisoner was here quite a while ago because I think they were still in slopping out time. But I understand the netting is actually, I know the netting on the different levels has been added, but the netting on the ones was always there. It just used to be a Victorian netting, which wasn't spring-loaded.
Well, the Victorians had it on the ones, which is the ground floor technically, and on the threes. You can see the steel eye bolts that's sitting out on the threes. So they put more in over there. Remember, the steel netting's been around for a long, long time, but certainly probably since the 1920s or 30s. We've had this renewed and replaced. It's what they call spring-loaded now. There would be incidents with the netting. It's there for safety reasons. It might be people that may decide they want to jump off a landing, and believe me, if you're on the threes and fours and you jump off, if there was no netting, you're not going to survive that. And there'll be some that jump on the netting. Prisoners sometimes jump on the netting as part of their protest. So they'll jump up and be springing up and down, and obviously that we have to deal with that and manage to get the prisoners off. They're pretty strong, but I think if you land on them, as that person said on a comment, from any height, it's possible to land awkward on this because it is steel and probably end up breaking an ankle or doing some damage, but probably not life-threatening. It's going to save your life one way or the other, but the netting's always been there.
And I've just had a great question come in that is very on point for me, and people that follow me on social media will get this with a grin, I'm sure. But Sarah's just asked, why don't prisoners have ceilings between floors? It's because they were built for social distancing.
Yeah, I mean,
it's exactly the reason to keep them
think of
separate.
the Victorian, they go, if this is open and the floor that we're standing on wasn't here when I come here, this was still just like the landings that you can see upstairs. Everything was hollow in the middle. And the idea behind that, there were no offices in these wings at all when I came here, so you could stand on the ones at the bottom end of the entrance gate and see all the way up to the top of the fours at the far end. And what you got was maximum supervision with a minimum amount of staff. Bearing in mind in the Victorian days, prisoners, like I said, were much more, there would have been a silent regime running, it would have been much harsher. They came out, sat outside their doors to do their sewing.
One man to a cell.
One man to a cell as well. So you didn't have the problem with 2 men in a cell or 3 men in a cell as we had at some stage. So, yeah.
It literally is. When we talk, and we've been talking about this a lot, and we will continue to push this point. When we say prisons, and Victorian prisons, especially Shepton and Shrewsbury that we operate, were designed for social distancing, that is absolutely true. It's not an on point thing that we're making up or anything like that. That's exactly what they were designed for, to stop people from socialising.
When I worked in Gartree Prison and I worked in Featherstone Prison, they're built in the 60s and 70s. The reality is each of the floors are sealed. They're on 2 stories or 3 stories maximum. They're much smaller units, but it's really like walking down the gantry of a ship. It's literally, you can actually touch both doors just by walking down the middle. You can very near touch the ceiling. So you feel a lot more isolated and it's a lot more claustrophobic. Personally, I much prefer these open style prisons where you've got that sense of space. And in some prisons that I worked in Gartree, they had little dog legs. So you'd walk down a landing and you'd have to turn left or turn right down to a blank end. So you're quite isolated down those situations. So personally, I prefer, and more modern prisons are starting to be built more like this now. They've gone back to this style, perhaps not strict. They might do 2 floors that are open, seal it and put another 2 floors up above it. But they've got these much more down the sides of the landings and open spaces in the middle. So we have they've recognised that the Victorians weren't that dull after all.
Okay, we are there. We've gone over our time actually because we started on time today. We had no technical issues, so we've managed to cram more time in. And next week, he says, touching wood, should be even easier for us because we're going to go into the Governor's office. So we will cover the Governor's office, Governor Secretary's office. I think those will probably be the 2 areas. I don't think we'll get underneath the Governor's office next week.
Do I get to sit down then?
Well, I was thinking I would sit down in the Governor's chair and you could address me.
I'm going to do this in a seat.
Okay,
so
we will do the Governor's. What I might even try and do next week is I might even try and get Jerry Hendry, who is the last governor here at Shrewsbury Prison, on the phone to maybe join us for a few
absolutely,
minutes.
Terrific governor, Jerry was, if he's happened to be watching in on this.
He's not. I don't think he uses Facebook.
Get on, no, he doesn't.
Does he? Well, brilliant. There we go. Ladies and gents, boys and girls, that has been us. Next week we're in the Governor's office.
Yep.
The week after we are going to be on A-Wing 1s. Now, what we'd planned to do today, the idea of today was we were supposed to have people all above us watching. Obviously, we're closed, so we're not able to do that. But the week after, which is 8th? Harriet?
Yeah.
8th of July, I believe. So the Wednesday after the 4th of July. Someone give me a date. Harriet, give me a date. 8th of July, perfect. 8th of July, we are going to do the servery. So we're going to be down on the 1s in A-Wing at the far end. So people will be able to come and watch. They'll be able to stand on the landings above and watch down. They'll be able to stand on A1s and obviously watch us do it. Obviously social distancing. Officer Goodwin's going to cover the servery, the meals that prisoners would have had, how they were cooked, how they were served, that entire process. And we will also cover one of the officers' pods down there because we've got one right next to it. And we can look at the difference of how it was done in the Victorian times, Gregorian times, Georgian times, and modern day, and how that's changed. So we'll do that the week after. So next week's Governors, I've put a link on for the comments there. We obviously open next week on the Saturday, the 4th of July.
Week on Saturday, yeah.
Yeah, so we'll obviously all be here for that, and lots more news and stuff coming in the next 24 hours, including the discounts. But that's kind of it from me.
Can't wait to get back to being busy again. Get some people in, have some fun, really enjoy it, and learn loads of things while you're in here. You get the chance to learn things you never heard of before, and you get to have some fun at the same time. What could be better?
Absolutely, and we've got enough cells for every single person every single day.
Yeah.
So, okay, perfect. That is it for me.
Lovely.
I think we're both on the same camera for a change.
Oh, excellent.
No, we're both there.
You got me on a slim camera today. Well done.
I told you, new camera system.
Yeah.
Should have done this weeks ago.
That's right. Mind you, I have lost about half a stone in the last 2 weeks.
It's all the walking.
Yeah.
Anyway, look, we're going to continue to have this conversation off camera. Thank you very much, everybody, and we will speak to you next week for our live on Wednesday in the Governor's Office.
Absolutely, looking forward to it.